You are not his father. For words. Spoken in a sterile hospital corridor by a doctor who had no idea he was detonating a bomb inside the chest of the most dangerous man in the city. Kyung Ju-won, Korean Mafia boss, feared by rivals, worshipped by his crew, had survived assassinations, betrayals, and bloodshed. But nothing prepared him for this. The son he built his entire empire for wasn't his. And while his world collapsed in silence, it was Thelma, his black secretary, 3 years of stolen glances and swallowed feelings, who looked him dead in the eyes and said, "Stop wasting our time, Kyung, put a baby in me, right now." Not out of desperation, not out of pity, but because she had watched this man bleed quietly for years, faithful to a woman who was selling his secrets to his enemies, and she was done waiting for the right moment. Some feelings don't survive patience. Did you know? In Korean culture, the concept of kibin, a person's mood, pride, and emotional harmony, governs nearly every social interaction. To shatter a man's kibin this completely is considered a wound deeper than any physical injury. In this world, Kyung didn't just lose a son. He lost his face, his name, and his reason, all at once. And there you have it. A forbidden romance forged in the wreckage of betrayal, where survival becomes the reason two people finally stop pretending they don't need each other. Secrets kept for 3 years. A war neither of them started, and a love neither of them planned. Are you at work secretly binge-watching, lying in bed when you should be sleeping, or maybe escaping reality on your commute? Where are my story lovers tuning in from today? Drop it below. I love knowing where you all are. Kyung Ju-won did not walk into rooms. He arrived in them. There was a difference, and everyone who had ever been in his presence understood it instinctively, the way prey understands the shift in air before a predator moves. Shoulders squared, chin level, eyes that cataloged everything and revealed nothing. He was 38 years old and had not raised his voice in a boardroom in 6 years, because he had learned long ago that silence was the loudest weapon in any room. He ran the Ju-won syndicate from the 42nd floor of a glass tower in the heart of the city. Legitimate businesses on the surface, a labyrinth of controlled chaos underneath. Construction, logistics, private security, and beneath all of that, the kind of work that never appeared on any tax filing. His crew feared him. His rivals respected him. His wife barely looked at him anymore. That last part he had learned to live with. Or so he told himself. What he could not learn to live without, though he would never have admitted it under any form of duress, was the quiet efficiency of Thelma Horns. She had walked into his office 3 years ago in a burgundy blazer, a leather portfolio tucked under one arm, and the particular energy of a woman who had already decided she was getting the job before she sat down. She got it. Within 6 months, she was indispensable. Within a year, she knew his schedule better than he did, anticipated his moods before they surfaced, and had developed the rare and valuable skill of knowing exactly when to speak and when to simply exist in his space without demanding anything from it. He noticed her. Of course he noticed her. He was dangerous, not dead. But he was also married. And whatever else Kyung Ju-won was, he had drawn that line in concrete and refused to cross it. So they existed in the space between professional, precise, and crackling with something neither of them named. On the morning everything changed, Thelma had placed a black coffee on his desk at 7:42, laid out 3 contracts requiring his signature, and mentioned, without looking up from her tablet, that Jiho's school had called. His son had taken a fall on the playground. Nothing serious. But the hospital wanted a parent present for routine checks. Kyung had signed the contracts, finished the coffee, and driven to the hospital himself. No driver. No security detail. Some things a man did alone. He remembered the way the corridor smelled, antiseptic and recycled air. He remembered the squeak of his shoes on the polished floor. He remembered the doctor's face, mid-50s, kind eyes, the careful expression of a man preparing to deliver information he wished belonged to someone else's shift. He did not remember deciding to call Thelma. But she was there when the words landed. The blood work is conclusive, Mr. Ju-won. The boy, he is not your biological son. The world did not spin. It simply stopped, like a film reel snapping mid-frame, leaving only white. Jiho, 7 years old, gap-toothed smile, obsessed with dinosaurs. Fell asleep every time Kyung put on a documentary, but would fight sleep with everything he had just to stay in the room with him. Jiho, who called him Appa like it was the most natural word in any language. Not his. Kyung stood in that corridor for a long time after the doctor walked away. Long enough for the fluorescent lights to feel like an interrogation. Long enough for 3 years of small suspicions, late nights, cold shoulders, locked phones, to rearrange themselves into a shape he could finally name. Thelma said nothing. She stood 2 feet behind him, and she did not offer empty words or a consoling hand. She simply stayed, present, solid, like a wall he didn't know he needed to lean against. That was the thing about Thelma Horns. She always knew what a moment required, and she never gave it more or less than that. Kim Ji-woo was beautiful the way certain poisons were beautiful, vivid, deliberate, and designed to be picked up. Kyung had married her 11 years ago at the insistence of an alliance between families, wearing a suit that cost more than most people's cars and feeling, somewhere beneath the ceremony, that he was signing a contract rather than beginning a life. He had been right. He simply hadn't known the full terms until now. He found her in their penthouse at 9 in the evening, standing at the floor-to-ceiling window with a glass of white wine, the city glittering below her like something she owned. He placed the hospital paperwork on the marble counter between them. Said nothing. Let her read it. She did. Slowly. Then she set down her glass with extraordinary care, turned to face him, and said, "So now you know. No tears. No trembling. Not even the performance of remorse. Just 3 words delivered with the tired relief of someone finally putting down a weight they'd carried too long." What followed was not a conversation. It was a demolition. She told him he was never home, that she had been alone inside this marriage for years while he built his empire and polished his reputation and forgot that a wife was a person and not a fixture. She told him that she had found warmth elsewhere because he had made their home a cold place, and she would not apologize for surviving it. Kyung listened. He was good at listening. It was one of the things that made him so effective and so unknowable. He let her finish. Then he asked one question. "Park-sun." The flicker across her eyes was less than a second. But Kyung had built a career on reading fractions of a second. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. By 10 o'clock, Kim had called her attorney. By midnight, the filing was done. She moved through the penthouse collecting things with a brisk efficiency that told him she had been packed, in her mind, for a long time. He sat in his study after she left and looked at the city the same way she had, from above in silence, and felt something he had not expected. Not rage, not heartbreak in the traditional sense, but a profound and crushing loneliness. The kind that tells you the grief isn't about the person leaving. It's about realizing how long you've already been alone. He didn't hear Thelma come in. She had a key. She always had a key for the late nights and the early emergencies. She appeared in the doorway of the study with 2 mugs of tea, assessed the room in one glance, and sat across from him without being invited or asking permission. They sat like that for a long time. Then, quietly, without strategy or calculation, his face broke. Not dramatically. Not the way it happens in films. Just a slow and terrible unraveling. A single sound low in his chest that he could not stop, and Kyung Ji-won, who had not cried in front of another human being since his mother's funeral, wept. Thelma did not look away. She did not move to him immediately or flood the silence with reassurance. She let him be human. She bore witness to it with the kind of steady, unflinching grace that some people spend their whole lives searching for in another person and never find. When it passed, she handed him the tea. He took it. She was feeding him information, he said finally. Park Sunday. The ambush on the Incheon shipment last year. The fire at the Mapo warehouse. That was her. Thelma's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I know. He looked at her. How long have you known? Long enough that I almost told you. Not long enough that I was certain. She held his gaze. I'm sorry I waited. In psychology, the phenomenon Kyung experienced, grieving a relationship that was already emotionally dead long before it ended, is called ambiguous loss. It is considered one of the most psychologically complex forms of grief precisely because there is no clear moment to mourn. The empire had a crack in it now. But cracks, Kyung had learned, were also where the light got in. And sitting across from him, warming her hands on a mug of tea in his darkened study, was the most dangerous kind of light there was. The kind you didn't see coming until it had already changed everything. Thelma came back the next morning. She didn't announce it, didn't text ahead or frame it as anything official. She simply appeared at his door at 7:15 with a brown paper bag of food from the place on the corner he'd mentioned exactly once, 6 months ago, in passing. Juk, Korean rice porridge, because she had done her research, and she knew it was what Koreans reached for when the world became too heavy for anything more substantial. He let her in without a word. They ate at the kitchen counter, the city waking up noisily outside the window, and for a long while neither of them spoke. It was the kind of silence that didn't need filling. The kind that meant something. You don't have to stay, he said eventually. I know, she said, and stayed. That was the morning something shifted permanently between them. Not dramatically, not with a declaration, but with the quiet insistence of a tide that has decided to come in and cannot be reasoned with. She began talking first. Not about Kim, not about the case, not about the empire. She told him what she had actually observed over 3 years. Not as his secretary cataloging his schedule, but as a person paying close attention to another person. She told him she had watched him cover for people who didn't deserve it. Absorb blame to protect his crew. Visit his mother's grave every year on the anniversary of her death, alone, without telling anyone where he was going. You think you're made of stone, she said, without judgment. But you're the most quietly decent person I've ever worked for. And I've worked for some genuinely terrible human beings. He looked at her for a moment. That's a low bar. She almost smiled. Take the compliment, Kyung. It was the first time she had used his name without his title. Neither of them acknowledged it. Both of them felt it. He talked then. Slowly at first, the way a man talks when he's out of practice with honesty, testing each word before committing to it. He told her about the marriage. Not the betrayal, but the years before it. The loneliness of building something vast and coming home to a woman who looked at his success like it was a wall between them rather than something he had built for them. He told her about Jiho, how he had coached himself, after the hospital, to separate the love from the biology, and how he was failing at it. Because you could not unlove a child. You simply could not. He still calls you Appa, Thelma said quietly. He doesn't know anything yet. Then he still calls you Appa, she repeated, like it was a fact that needed standing on its own. Something moved through Kyung's face. He looked away. The moment came in the afternoon, soft and unannounced. They were standing at the window. She was pointing out something in the street below, something small and ordinary, a child chasing a dog. And he turned to look at her instead of the street, and she felt it and turned to find his face very close and very serious. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she stepped back. One deliberate step. Not from fear, but from knowing, with absolute clarity, that if they crossed this particular threshold in the wreckage of the last 48 hours, it would be built on damage. And what she wanted, if she was honest with herself for the first time in 3 years, was something built on solid ground. Not like this, she said, barely above a whisper. He nodded. Immediately. As if he had been waiting for someone to say the sensible thing, because he was not capable of saying it himself right now. She picked up her bag. Paused at the door. I'll be at the office at 8, she said. The CO brothers want a meeting. You need to eat a real breakfast first. He almost smiled. It didn't quite make it to his face. But it was close. She left. And he stood in the apartment that no longer felt like a trap, breathing a little easier than he had in years. The file landed on Kyung's desk on a Tuesday. Thick. Tabbed. Assembled by his head of intelligence, a quiet, methodical man named Ro who had been with the syndicate for 14 years and had the particular gift of finding things people were absolutely certain could not be found. Kyung read it without moving for 40 minutes. When he was done, he closed it, placed both hands flat on the desk, and sat very, very still, the way he did when something required the full weight of his self-control to process without becoming destruction. Kim Ji-woo had been in contact with Choi Park-sun for 2 years and 4 months. Not 11 months, as he had initially suspected. 2 years and 4 months. Which meant it had begun not as a response to unhappiness, not as a consequence of a marriage falling apart, but as a deliberate and premeditated operation. She had attended his events, smiled at his associates, slept beside him, and all the while she had been photographed in private restaurants, luxury hotel lobbies, and a beachfront property registered in a shell company's name, with the man who had been trying to dismantle Kyung's empire from the outside while she was dismantling it from within. The Incheon shipment ambush, the Mapo warehouse fire, a kidnapping attempt on one of his lieutenants that had been written off as opportunistic. It was none of those things. Every single incident had been preceded by a dinner, a phone call, a message sent from a secondary device Kim kept in a hollowed-out hardcover book in her dressing room. Ro had found the book. Kyung called Thelma into the office. She read the file standing up, which was how she read everything that mattered, as if sitting down might slow her comprehension. Her expression did not change dramatically, but her stillness deepened in a way Kyung had learned to read as fury held at a precise and deliberate temperature. She gave him the Incheon manifest 3 days before the ambush, Thelma said, not looking up. 2 of your men were hospitalized. Yes. She closed the file. Set it down with the careful restraint of someone who wanted to throw it. What do you need from me? I need you to help me build a case that survives a courtroom. He leaned back, watching her. Not the street. The courtroom. I want her to lose everything through the law, slowly, completely, and in public. Thelma looked at him, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with the file or the law or the syndicate, a recognition, mutual and unspoken, that they were now in this together in a way that went beyond employment. Then we start with the financial trail, she said. The shell company. We trace every transfer. He nodded. She sat down across from him and opened her laptop. He pulled his chair around to her side of the desk, a thing he had never done before, always maintained the geography of hierarchy between them. And they worked through the afternoon side by side, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, building the architecture of Kim's undoing one document at a time. At some point, Thelma reached across him for a printout, and he caught her wrist, gently, briefly, just to pause her. She looked up. He looked at her. No words. Just the acknowledgement of something present and real and patient enough to wait for the right moment. She found the printout herself. They kept working. Forensic accountants, specialists who investigate financial crime, can trace money across dozens of shell companies using a technique called follow the paper. Some have unraveled billion-dollar fraud cases from a single mismatched receipt. By evening, they had enough for a preliminary motion. By the time Thelma closed her laptop and reached for her coat, the case against Kim Ji-woo had a spine. And the thing quietly growing between Kyung and his secretary had one too. The numbers didn't lie. Kyung sat at the head of the conference table at 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night, his attorney on one side, a spreadsheet on the screen in front of him that represented, in clean, unfeeling columns, exactly how much of his life Kim Ji-woo was legally entitled to walk away with. 50%. Not of the syndicate. The syndicate existed in shadows and shell structures and could not be formally valued in any courtroom. But the legitimate holdings, the construction company, the logistics firm, the 4 commercial properties, the investment portfolio, all of it built over a decade of calculated, exhausting work. Half of it was about to transfer to a woman who had spent 2 years feeding his enemies the coordinates of his operations. His attorney, a precise man named Beck who charged extraordinary fees and earned every one of them, walked him through the projections without editorializing. Numbers. Timelines. Probable outcomes. The language of inevitability. When Beck left, Kyung stayed. He sat alone in the conference room for a long time. The city laid out beneath him in indifferent light, and did something he rarely permitted himself. He felt the full weight of it. Not the anger. The anger was manageable, even useful. But the absurdity. The profound, almost darkly comic absurdity of a man who had outmaneuvered rivals, survived 3 attempts on his life, and built an empire from violence and discipline. Being undone by a marriage he had known, somewhere in the marrow of him, was wrong from the beginning. He heard the door. Thelma stood in the frame, coat still on, bag over her shoulder. She had left 2 hours ago. She had come back. She looked at him, really looked, the way she did when she wasn't performing professionalism and was simply being a person in the presence of another person. And she crossed the room and sat down across from him without theatrics or preamble. "Tell me where you are," she said. 50%, he said. To her. After everything in that file. Thelma said nothing for a moment. Then she set her bag down on the table, folded her hands, and looked at him with an expression he had never seen on her face before. Not composed, not strategic. Open. Decided. "There's another way," she said. He waited. "We make a baby." She held his gaze without flinching. "Right now. Tonight. You start a family that is yours, biological, legal, undeniable. And you give yourself something worth more than the 50% she's taking." The room was very quiet. "Thelma, I have loved you for 3 years," she said. The words came out level and clear, like something that had been waiting a long time to be said in exactly the right tone. Not the boss. Not the title. You. The man who visits his mother's grave alone. The man who remembered my sister's surgery date without being reminded and cleared my schedule without telling me why. She paused. "I stopped pretending otherwise about 18 months ago. I just kept it in its lane because you were married and you were decent about it, and I respected that." Her eyes didn't waver. "But that's done now." She ended it. "So I'm telling you the truth." Kyung looked at her for a long time. The kind of look that isn't reading a person so much as finally allowing yourself to see what was already there. "A year ago," he said quietly. "Maybe 14 months. I started," he stopped. Chose the next words carefully. "I started having to remind myself why certain things were not options." Thelma absorbed that. Didn't perform a reaction. Just held it. "And now," she said. He stood. Slowly. Walked around the table until he was in front of her. She tilted her face up to his and did not move, Not toward him, not away. Just present. Unwavering. He reached out and tucked one curl behind her ear with a deliberateness that made it feel like a declaration. Now, he said, I don't have to remind myself of anything. He kissed her. And she kissed him back like she had been ready for exactly this long enough that readiness had become its own kind of peace. They did not make a baby that night. What they did was talk until 3 a.m, sprawled on opposite ends of the conference room couch that had never been used for anything except overflow storage, shoes off, empty coffee mugs between them. In the particular way two people talk when they have been guarding themselves around each other for years and have finally, mutually, agreed to put the guard down. It was revelatory. Not because the things they said were extraordinary, but because saying them was. Thelma told him about growing up in Atlanta. Her mother, a schoolteacher who graded papers at the kitchen table every night. Her father, who left when she was 9 and to whom she had never quite managed indifference, which irritated her far more than the leaving itself. She told him she had taken a corporate job after college and discovered she was exceptional at organizing other people's chaos, which was less a career aspiration than an accidental superpower. She told him she had dated a man for 4 years who needed her competence more than he wanted her company, and she had confused being needed with being loved for long enough to lose a significant portion of her 20s to the distinction. Kyung listened the way he did everything, completely, without interruption, and when she finished he said, with characteristic directness, he was an idiot. She laughed. Fully, unexpectedly, the kind of laugh that escapes before it can be made presentable. He looked startled by it for a moment, and then something in his face softened in a way she had never seen before, as if the sound of her laughing had rearranged something in him. He talked about his mother, about growing up in a household where love was expressed through sacrifice rather than affection, food on the table, shoes that fit, a good school, and how he had inherited that language so completely that he had spent his adult life providing for people without ever learning to simply be with them. He talked about Jiho, about the dinosaur books and the documentary naps, and a Tuesday 3 months ago when the boy had reached up mid-walk and taken his hand without asking, and how Kyung had carried that small moment around ever since like something he couldn't explain and didn't want to examine too closely because it hurt in a way that felt important. He's still yours, Thelma said. Not as comfort. As fact. Biology says otherwise. Biology, she said, is the least interesting thing about being a father. He looked at her. She met his eyes without backing down from it. They both knew she was right. They got food delivered at midnight, proper food, absurd quantities of it, eaten directly from containers. And somewhere between the second round of coffee and an argument about whether Busan or Seoul had better street food that Thelma was hilariously unqualified to have, and had anyway, the last of the distance between them dissolved. Not with fanfare. Just with a moment when they were both laughing about something inconsequential, and they stopped at the same time and looked at each other, and the laughter became something else. Warm and still and full of a future that was suddenly, quietly possible. He kissed her again. Slower this time. Without the weight of the conference room and the spreadsheet and the 50%. Just the two of them. Whatever this is, he said against her hair, I want to do it right. Not in the middle of a war. We're already in a war, she pointed out. Then after. Kyung. She pulled back just enough to see his face. We don't get to choose when. We only get to choose who. She held his gaze. I'm choosing you. Right now, in the middle of all of it. That's the offer. He pressed his forehead to hers. Outside, the city hummed and glittered, entirely indifferent. Then I'm choosing you back, he said quietly. Oxytocin, the brain's bonding hormone, releases not just during physical intimacy, but during sustained eye contact, deep conversation, and shared laughter. Science confirms what Thelma already knew. Connection is built in the quiet moments, not just the dramatic ones. By the time they finally left the building, the sky had begun its slow gray shift toward dawn. They walked to the elevator side by side, not touching, but closer than they had ever stood before. A new geometry. One that felt, against all reasonable odds in a life built on danger and calculation, like the safest place either of them had ever occupied. You didn't stumble onto this story by accident. Something brought you here, and now you know why. If Kyung and Thelma have got you in a chokehold, subscribe and hit the notification bell right now, before the algorithm buries us and you miss the key moments in the story. Tell me in the comments section, what was the moment that got you? The hospital corridor? The conference room couch? Thelma saying, I'm choosing you. Right now, in the middle of all of it, I read every comment. I show up. Just like she did. Don't lose this story. It's just getting started. Beck was not a man who smiled in courtrooms. He considered it unprofessional, A tell, like a poker player who couldn't keep his hands still when he held a winning hand. In 14 years of litigation, through corporate battles and criminal defenses, and the kind of cases that never made the news but rearranged entire power structures, he had maintained the same expression from opening statement to final ruling. Focused, unreadable, precise. On the morning of the preliminary divorce hearing, he almost smiled. Kim Ju-woo arrived with 2 attorneys and the practiced composure of a woman who believed the outcome was already written. She wore charcoal gray. She did not look at Kyung. Her lead attorney, a sharp-shouldered woman named Counsel Lim, had built a formidable case, meticulous documentation of the marital estate, asset valuations, a settlement demand that was, by every conventional measure, legally airtight. Conventional being the operative word. Beck let Counsel Lim present the full scope of her argument. He let her lay out every asset, every property, every account. He let the numbers fill the courtroom with their clean, damning totality. He waited until she had finished, until the room carried the specific silence of a conclusion that believes itself to be final. Then he stood up and placed a single document on the judge's bench. "Your Honor," he said, in the tone of a man delivering routine paperwork, "the marital estate as outlined by opposing counsel does not exist." The room shifted. What followed was 40 minutes of meticulous, almost surgical legal demolition. The construction company, registered 11 years ago in the name of Han Soo-yeon, Kyung's mother. The logistics firm, Han Soo-yeon. The commercial properties, all 4 Han Soo-yeon. The investment portfolio, the holding company, the subsidiary accounts, Han Soo-yeon, Han Soo-yeon, Han Soo-yeon. Kyung had done it years before the marriage, at his accountant's suggestion, as an estate planning and liability protection strategy. His mother had been alive then. He had meant to restructure after her death. He had been busy. He had forgotten. He had forgotten. Kim's attorney was on her feet. Objections flew. The judge demanded order and got it, then spent 12 minutes reviewing the documentation with the particular intensity of someone looking for a crack and finding none. There was no crack. Beck had spent 3 weeks making sure of it. The assets cited in the petitioner's filing, the judge said finally, with the measured tone of someone delivering a verdict they find genuinely interesting, are not marital property under any applicable statute. They belong to the estate of Han Soo-yeon, of which the respondent is sole heir. She looked over her glasses. The settlement claim as structured cannot proceed. Kim did not scream. She was too controlled for that. But the color left her face in a single, visible wave, and for just a moment, one unguarded, electric moment, her eyes found Kyung's across the room. He looked back at her with an expression that contained nothing. Not triumph. Not satisfaction. Just the flat, final closure of a door. Outside the courtroom, in the marble corridor, it was Thelma who spoke first. She was standing slightly behind him, tablet in hand, maintaining the professional geometry they had preserved in public. But he felt her presence the way you feel warmth from a fireplace across a room. "She owes you 50 million, Thelma said quietly. The countersuit, filed the previous week, meticulously documented, built on the intelligence file Rowe had assembled and the financial trail Thelma had traced, had moved faster than anyone anticipated once the marital asset claim collapsed. Kim had not merely been unfaithful. She had committed actionable corporate espionage. The Incheon ambush alone had cost the syndicate's legitimate logistics arm over 20 million in losses, insurance claims, and personnel damages that existed entirely on paper and entirely legally. "She'll have to borrow it," Kyung said. "From him," Thelma said. They both understood what that meant. A woman who had used Park Sun as a weapon against her husband would now be financially bound to him. Indebted, dependent, trapped in the web she had been so certain she was spinning for someone else. Beck appeared beside them, closing his briefcase with a quiet click. "We'll have the formal ruling within 10 days, he said. "Congratulations, Mr. Ju-won." He paused. "Your mother would have found this deeply satisfying." Kyung said nothing. But somewhere beneath the composure, in the place he kept things that mattered, he thought Beck was probably right. The first attack came on a Thursday. Kyung's convoy, 2 vehicles, 6 men, a routine transfer of documentation between the logistics headquarters and their legal office downtown, was hit at an underpass on the west side of the city at 11:40 in the morning. Not by amateurs. By people who knew the route, knew the timing, and had prepared accordingly. 3 men were injured. None killed. A fact that Kyung understood immediately was not mercy but message. Park Sun wanted him to know it was him. Wanted him to feel the proximity of it before the killing started. By the time Kyung arrived at the scene, Thelma beside him, because she had been in the car behind the convoy and he was not, at this point, pretending that her safety was a secondary concern. His head of security, a former military man named Do, was already coordinating the response. They knew the schedule, Do said without preamble. They've known our schedules for 2 years, Kyung replied. That ends today. Everything changes. Routes, timings, communication channels. Everything. Thelma was standing at the edge of the scene, looking at the damaged vehicle with an expression that had moved cleanly through shock and arrived at something colder and more useful. She turned to Kyung. They hit the documentation transfer, she said. They weren't trying to stop you. They were trying to intercept the countersuit filings. He looked at her. Park knows the ruling is coming, she continued, working it through aloud. Kim told him. He's not just retaliating. He's trying to collapse the legal case before it finalizes. She paused, which means he's scared of it. Kyung held her gaze for a moment, then turned to Do. Double the filing security. Everything goes through Beck's office directly. No transfers. Do nodded and moved. What came after was not a single confrontation but a sustained, escalating siege. The kind of warfare that happens below the threshold of what makes the news but above the threshold of what can be absorbed without response. Park's crew hit a Ju-1 warehouse on the east side. Kyung's men dismantled 2 of Park's distribution operations in return, efficiently and without attribution. A Ju-1 lieutenant was followed home. Kyung moved him and his family within the hour and sent 4 men to have a quiet, thorough conversation with the people doing the following. Through all of it, Thelma did not leave. This was the part that Kyung had not expected. Not her courage, which he had always intuited, but her specificity. She was not reckless. She was not performing bravery. She assessed each situation with the same clear-eyed precision she brought to his contracts and his schedule, identified where she was useful, and planted herself there. She rerouted communications when their channels were compromised. She found a discrepancy in Park's shell company structure that Rowe had missed and flagged it to Beck at midnight on a Tuesday. When a threat was phoned into the office and the building required evacuation, she was the last one out. Not from stubbornness, but because she had stayed to copy 3 drives of evidence first. He found her in the stairwell on her way down, drives in her coat pocket, and looked at her with an expression that she would later describe to herself as the moment she understood completely what it felt like to be truly seen by another person. You were supposed to be out, he said. The evidence wasn't, she replied. He took her face in both hands. Right there in the stairwell, fluorescent light, concrete walls, the distant sound of the street below, and kissed her with the particular desperation of a man who has just understood, viscerally and without abstraction, what it would mean to lose her. She kissed him back with equal measure, then pulled back, checked the drives were still in her pocket, and said, "Can we finish the war first?" He almost laughed. It came out as something between a breath and a sound unfamiliar in his chest. The specific lightness of being known by someone who chooses to stay anyway. They came out of the stairwell together. His hand found the small of her back for exactly 3 seconds before they re-entered the world of other people. 3 seconds that contained, compressed and wordless, everything they had chosen and everything they were fighting for. The strategic targeting of legal documents during criminal conflicts is well documented. In several major international organized crime prosecutions, including cases tried under the RICO Act, the U.S. law designed to dismantle criminal enterprises. Key convictions hinged on financial paper trails that perpetrators had tried and failed to destroy. By the end of the week, the siege had not ended. But it had changed shape. Park Sun was no longer attacking infrastructure. He was hunting specifically, for Kyung, and increasingly, for the woman always beside him. Which told Kyung everything he needed to know about how visible Thelma had become, and how completely, dangerously, irreversibly she had become the thing he could least afford to lose. There was a particular hour, somewhere between 2 and 4 in the morning, when the city outside had quieted to its bones, that had become theirs without either of them deciding it. It was the hour when the war paused, when the encrypted phones went silent and the security rotations settled and the tactical calculations that consumed their daylight hours released their grip, just slightly, just enough. Kyung would find Thelma in whichever room she had claimed, his study, the kitchen counter, once the floor of the archive room surrounded by documents. And they would exist together in the quiet like 2 people who had discovered, late and against considerable odds, that the world was bearable when the right person was in it. They did not talk about the future during those hours. The future was too contested, too populated with variables they couldn't control. Instead, they talked about small things, specific things, the kind of granular, unhurried conversation that is actually the most intimate kind, the kind that says, "I want to know the texture of your life, not just the outline of it." She told him about the smell of her mother's kitchen on Sunday mornings. He told her about the 1 year, age 12, when he had wanted to be a marine biologist, before the weight of his family's expectations had redirected him toward a different relationship with power. She laughed at that, the image of a young Kyung Ju-won, future crime lord, earnestly invested in ocean ecosystems. And he let her laugh, which was itself a thing he would not have permitted anyone else. But the war did not stay outside forever. The hit came on a Friday evening, not at a convoy, not at a warehouse, but at a restaurant where Thelma was meeting a friend. Civilian space. Deliberate. Park Sun had escalated from targeting Kyung's operations to targeting what Kyung loved, which was the clearest possible signal that the intelligence he was receiving still, somehow, was intimate enough to know that Thelma was no longer just an employee. She was out of the restaurant before the men got through the door. Kyung's security, rotating plain clothes since the stairwell incident, extracted her cleanly. No one was hurt. But Kyung, when he got the call, sat very still for 11 seconds. His team had learned to count those silences. And then stood and began issuing instructions in a voice that had dropped to its quietest register, which everyone in the room understood was not calm but the precise opposite of calm, contained by will alone. He did not sleep that night. He sat in the main room of the safe house they had moved to 2 weeks earlier, going through Park's network map with Do and Ro, dismantling the architecture of the man's operation piece by piece, looking for the trap they were going to set and the door they were going to close permanently. Thelma appeared at 4 in the morning. She sat beside him, not across, and looked at the network map with the same focused expression she brought to everything. After a while she pointed to a name in the outer ring of Park's financial structure. A name that had appeared twice in documents she had processed, and once in the shell company discrepancy she had flagged to Beck. "That's the thread," she said. She was right. She was almost always right about the threads. He looked at her in the low light of that room, tired, sharp, entirely herself, and felt it with a completeness that bypassed analysis entirely. That this was the person. Not the empire, not the dynasty, not the legacy he had spent his adult life constructing. This. Her. The particular and irreplaceable fact of her. "I need you to know something," he said. She turned to look at him. "If something happens to me." "Don't. Thelma." "I said don't." Her voice was steady, but her eyes said something else entirely. Something unguarded and fiercely unwilling. "You don't get to say that to me. Not now. You want to survive this, you stay focused on surviving it. You don't say goodbye in the middle of a fight." He held her gaze, then nodded. Once. Because she was right about that too. What happened next was not planned or strategic or even particularly discussed. It was the natural conclusion of two people who had chosen each other in the full knowledge of what choosing cost, who had looked at the odds and decided that a life half-lived in the name of safety was not actually living at all. They had built toward each other for 3 years. They had chosen each other across a war. And in the quiet of that safe house, with the network map still open on the table and the city still hostile beyond the walls, they stopped waiting for conditions to be right. The conditions would never be right. That was the truth they had both been circling. They gave themselves to each other fully, not with the urgency of desperation, but with the deliberateness of people who understood the value of what they were holding. It was tender and fierce in equal measure. It was for both of them the most honest thing they had done in years. Afterward, Kyung lay in the dark listening to her breathe and felt, for the first time in as long as he could remember, that the future was something he wanted rather than something he was managing. Not the empire. Not the assets. Just this. Her. What they might build. What they might become. He fell asleep with that thought still warm in his chest. 3 weeks later, in the middle of a briefing at the safe house table, Thelma reached into her coat pocket and placed a small white object on the map between them. It took him a moment to understand what he was looking at. The room had 6 other people in it. They all understood immediately and found somewhere else to direct their eyes. Kyung stared at the test. Then at Thelma, who was watching him with an expression of absolute composure that he had learned, by now, was what she looked like when she was feeling too much to show any of it. He pushed his chair back from the table, stood, and pulled her into him with both arms. Not carefully, not strategically, not with any of the composed restraint that governed every other movement he made. Just completely, in front of everyone, his face pressed into her hair, one hand against the back of her head. She held on. The room remained very quiet. Do, a man who had watched Kyung walk through firefights without visible emotion, later said it was the most frightening thing he had ever seen his boss do. Not because it was violent, but because it was completely unguarded. Because it meant that whatever happened next, there was now something that could truly break him. And in the world they were living in, that was the most dangerous thing imaginable. They took Park's son down on a Wednesday. Not in the street. Kyung had been explicit about that from the beginning. Not fire and blood, and the kind of ending that invited retribution from every direction and left a vacuum that 3 other men would immediately move to fill. Clean. Legal where possible, and where not possible, invisible. The kind of ending that closed doors. The thread Thelma had identified in the network map had led them, over 6 weeks of careful excavation, to a man named Counselor Wu. A mid-level government official with expensive tastes and a long-standing financial relationship with Park's son's outer organization. Wu had been the bridge, permits expedited, inspections overlooked, a prosecution quietly shelved 18 months ago when it had gotten uncomfortably close to Park's import operations. Ro had documented everything. Beck had structured it. And Kyung, through 2 carefully maintained legitimate connections in law enforcement. Men who owed him nothing illegal, only the long memory of favors that had never asked for anything in return, had ensured the evidence landed on the right desks. The arrests came at 6 in the morning. Park's son at his residential compound. Counselor Wu at his office. For members of Park's inner operations simultaneously, in different parts of the city, coordinated with the precision of people who had been planning it long enough to account for every variable. Kyung watched it from a feed on Do's laptop in a hotel room across the city. Thelma sat beside him, her hand resting on the table near his, not touching but present. The geometry they had perfected, private enough to be real, contained enough to let him be the man his team needed in this moment. When the confirmation came through, Park's son in custody, the operation intact, the countersuit ruling finalized in the same 24-hour window with a precision of timing that Beck had spent 3 weeks engineering. Kyung leaned back in his chair and let out a single long breath. Do started to speak. Kyung held up one finger. Not yet. He needed 60 seconds with the fact of it. The weight of it. 11 months from a hospital corridor to this room. Everything that had been dismantled, and everything that had been built in the space the dismantling left. He looked at Thelma. She was already looking at him. It's done, she said. Most of it, he said. She understood what he meant. Park was contained, not eliminated. Kim was financially destroyed, publicly humiliated, and now indebted to a man facing serious prosecution. Trapped in consequences entirely of her own construction. But organizations didn't disappear with their leaders. Networks redistributed. Vacuums filled. The war had a chapter ending, not a final page. But for today, for this morning, it was enough. The courthouse steps 3 days later. Kyung stood outside in the cold gray air, while Beck handled the final documentation inside. Watching the street with the particular stillness of a man who has spent so long anticipating threats that ordinary urban movement requires conscious reinterpretation. He was alone, by choice briefly, one of the small solitudes he permitted himself. He heard footsteps behind him. Small, quick, familiar in a way that bypassed all his threat assessment entirely. Jiho, 7 years old, wearing a school coat slightly too big for him, a gap in his smile where a tooth had recently departed. Moving across the courthouse steps with the absolute purposeful confidence of a child who has identified exactly where he needs to be and sees no obstacle between himself and it. He stopped in front of Kyung, looked up, and then, without preamble or qualification, he reached up and took Kyung's hand in both of his. The same gesture from that Tuesday 3 months ago in the street that Kyung had carried with him ever since. Appa, he said. Simply, like it was the most obvious word in any language. Kyung looked down at him for a moment that lasted, in the way certain moments do, much longer than its actual duration. Then he crouched down to the boy's level, something he had never done before, always maintained the adult geography between them, and looked at him directly. Yeah, he said quietly. I'm here. Jiho, satisfied, leaned into him. Kyung put an arm around the boy's shoulders and held on. Thelma appeared at the top of the steps and stopped when she saw them. She stood there in her red coat, one hand resting against her stomach. A gesture she had developed recently, unconscious and new and quietly radiant, and watched the two of them at the bottom of the steps with an expression that contained more than any word she might have chosen. Kyung looked up and found her eyes. She smiled. Not the composed, professional smile he had known for 3 years. The real one. The one that reached everything. The one he had learned was the most valuable thing in his considerable possession. He would sign the papers that afternoon. The Juwon Empire, restructured and renamed, registered in 3 names. His own, his mother's memory, and a name not yet chosen for a child not yet born. A dynasty rebuilt on different foundations. Truth instead of obligation. Choice instead of alliance. He stood up from the courthouse steps, Jiho's hand in his, and climbed toward Thelma. In South Korean law, a child raised by a man who is not the biological father can still be granted full legal paternity rights through recognition of paternity by conduct, meaning love, presence, and consistent care carry legal weight. Biology is not the only language the law speaks. 3 floors above the street, in the office of a law firm that Park Sun's remaining lieutenants had been using as a communication hub, a phone rang. It was answered by a man none of them had ever met. He had been watching the Ju-won situation for 11 months from a considerable distance, with the patient, calibrated attention of someone who understood that the most dangerous moment in any power shift was not the conflict itself, but the aftermath. When the victor was celebrating, when the guard came down, when a man with everything to live for became, paradoxically, the easiest target of all. He picked up the phone. "It's time," he said. And somewhere across the city, 3 separate operations, dormant, invisible, waiting, began to move. If this story has had you in a chokehold, welcome. You're exactly where you're supposed to be. Hit subscribe and ring that notification bell, because this is not the kind of story you want to stumble back to 3 episodes late wondering how everything fell apart. Be in the room when it happens. Now I need to hear from you. What moment broke you open? Was it the hospital corridor? Thelma sliding that pregnancy test across a warm app? Jiho reaching up and saying Apple like it cost him nothing? Or that final phone call that just rewrote everything you thought was over? Drop your favorite moment in the comments and tell me why it hit the way it did. I read every single one. I reply to more than you'd think. And honestly, your reactions are the best part of doing this. You catch things, you feel things, you call things out in ways that remind me exactly why stories like this need to be told. I'll be down there waiting for you. Don't make me wait alone.